Meanwhile, the three bound ghouls had been released and consoled by their conquering kinsfolk, whilst various parties searched the neighborhood for possible remaining moon beasts and boarded the evil-smelling black galley to the wharf to make sure that nothing had escaped the general defeat. Surely enough. The capture had been through, for not a sign of further life could the victors detect. Carter, anxious to preserve a means of access to the rest of Dreamland, urged them not to sink the anchored galley, and this request was granted freely out of the gratitude for his act in reporting the plight of the captured trio. On the ship were found some very curious objects and decorations, some of which Carter cast at once into the sea. Ghouls and night gaunts now formed themselves in separate groupings, the former questioning the rescued fellow anent past happenings. It appeared that the three had followed Carter's directions and proceeded from the enchanted wood to Dylathleen by the way of Near and the Sky, stealing human clothes at a lonely farmhouse and loping as closely as possible in the fashion of a man's walk in Dylathleen's taverns. Their grotesque ways and faces had aroused much comment, but they had persisted in asking the way to Sarkomand until, at last, an old traveler was able to tell them. Then they knew that only a ship for Le Log Lang would serve their purpose, and prepared to wait patiently for such a vessel. But evil spies had doubtless reported much, for shortly a black galley put into port, and the wide-mouthed ruby merchants invited the ghouls to drink with them in a tavern. Wine was produced from one of those sinister bottles grotesquely carven from a single ruby, and after that the ghouls found themselves prisoners on the black galley, as Carter had found himself. This time, however, the unseen rowers steered not for the moon, but for antique Sarkomand, bent evidently on taking their captives before the high priest, not to be described. They had touched at the jagged rock in the northern sea which Inquanok's mariners shun, and the ghouls had there seen for the first time the red masters of the ship, being sickened despite their own callousness by such extremes of malign shapelessness and a fearsome odor. There, too, were witnessed the nameless pastimes of the toad-like resident garrison, such pastimes as give rise to the night howlings which men fear. After that had come the landing at ruined Sarkomand, and the beginning of the tortures whose continuance the present rescue had prevented. Future plans were next discussed, the three rescued ghouls suggesting a raid on the jagged rock and the extermination of the toad-like garrison there. To this, however, the night gaunts objected, since the prospect of flying over water did not please them. Most of the ghouls favored the design, but were at a loss how to follow it without the help of winged night gaunts. Thereupon, Carter, seeing that they could not navigate the anchored galley, offered to teach them the use of the great banks of oars, to which proposal they eagerly assented. Gray day had now come, and under that leaden northern sky, a picked detachment of ghouls filed into the noisome ship and took their seats on the rowers' benches. Carter found them fairly apt at learning, and before night had risked several experimental trips around the harbor. Not till 3 days later, however, did he deem it safe to attempt the voyage of conquest. Then the rowers trained, and the night gaunts safely stowed in the forecastle. The partly set sail at last, Pickman and the other chiefs gathering on deck and discussing models of approach and procedure. On the very first night, the howlings from the rock were heard, Such was their timber, that all the galley's crew shook visibly, but most of all trembled the 3 rescued ghouls, who knew precisely what those howlings meant. It was not thought best to attempt an attack by night, so the ship lay to under the phosphorescent clouds to wait for the dawn of a grayish day. When the light was ample and the howlings still, the rowers resumed their strokes, and the galley drew closer and closer to that jagged rock, whose granite pinnacles clawed fantastically at the dull sky. The sides of the rock were very steep, but on ledges here and there could be seen the bulging walls of queer windowless dwellings, and the low railings guarding traveled highways. No ship of men had ever come so near the place, or at least had never come so near and departed again. The carter and the ghouls were void of fear and kept inflexibly on, rounding the eastern face of the rock and seeking the wharves, which the rescued trio described as being on the southern side, within a harbor formed of steep headlands. The headlands were prolongations of the island proper, and came so closely together that only one ship at a time might pass between them. There seemed to be no watchers on the outside, so that the galley was steered boldly through the flume-like strait and into the stagnant, putrid harbor beyond. Here, however, all was bustle and activity, with several ships lying at anchor along a forbidding stone quay, and scores of almost human slaves and moonbeasts by the waterfront, handling crates and boxes, or driving nameless and fabulous horrors hitched to lumbering lorries. There was a small stone town hewn out of the vertical cliff above the wharfs, with the start of a winding road that spiraled out of sight toward higher ledges of the rock. Of what lay inside the prodigious peak of granite, none might say, but the things one saw on the outside were far from encouraging. At sight of the incoming galley, the crowds on the wharfs displayed much eagerness, those with eyes staring intently, and those without eyes wriggling their pink tentacles expectantly. They did not, of course, realize that the black ship had changed hands, for ghouls look much like the horned and hooved almost humans, and the night gaunts were all out of sight below. By this time the leaders had fully formed a plan, which was to loose the night gaunts as soonly as the wharf was touched, and then to sail directly away, leaving matters wholly to the instincts of those almost mindless creatures marooned on the rock. The horned flyers would first of all seize whatever living things they found there, and afterward, quite helpless to think except in terms of the homing insect, would forget their fears of water and fly swiftly back to the abyss, bearing their noisome prey to appropriate destinations in the dark, from which not so much would emerge alive. The ghoul was Pickman now. The ghoul that was Pickman now went below and gave the night gaunts their simple instructions, while the ship drew very near to the ominous and malodorous wharves. As I get rumbly in the tumbly. Presently, a fresh stir rose along the waterfront, and Carter saw that the motions of the galley had begun to excite suspicion. Evidently the steersman was not making for the right dock, and probably the watchers had noticed the difference between the hideous ghouls and the almost human slaves, whose places they were taking. Some silent alarm must have been given, for almost at once a horde of the mephitic moonbeasts began to pour from the little black doorways of the windowless houses and down the winding road at the right. A rain of curious javelins struck the galley as the prow hit the wharf, felling 2 ghouls and slightly wounding another. But at this point, all the hatches were thrown open to admit a black cloud of whirring night gaunts which swarmed over the town like a flock of horned encyclopean bats. The jelly-ish moon beasts had procured a great pole and were trying to push off the invading ship. But when the night gaunt struck them, they thought of such things no more. It was a very terrible spectacle to see those faceless and rubbery ticklers at their pastime, and tremendously impressive to watch the dense cloud of them spreading through the town and up the winding roadway to the reaches above. Sometimes a group of the black flutterers would drop a toad-like prisoner from aloft by mistake, and the manner in which the victim would burst was highly offensive to the sight and smell. When the last of the night gaunts had left the galley, the ghoulish leaders delivered an order of withdrawal, and the rowers pulled quietly out of the harbor between the gray headlands, while still the town was a chaos of battle and conquest. The Pickman ghoul allowed several hours for night gaunts to make up the rudimentary minds and overcome their fear of flying over the sea, and kept the galley standing about a mile off the jagged rock while he waited and dressed the wounds of the injured men. Night fell, and the gray twilight gave place to the sticky phosphorescence of low clouds. And all the while the leaders watched the high peaks of the accursed rock for signs of the night gaunt's flight. Toward morning, a black speck was seen hovering timidly over the topmost pinnacle, and shortly afterward the speck had become a swarm. Just before daybreak, the swarm seemed to scatter, and within a quarter of an hour it had vanished wholly in the distance, toward the northeast. Remember, in this, if you're going to face Mecca or Jerusalem or Damascus in this age, northeast is, and I think the Great Pyramid too, northeast is your shortest distance over land. Once or twice, something seemed to fall from the thinning swarm into the sea, but Carter did not worry, since he knew from observation that the toad-like moon beasts cannot swim. At length, when the ghouls were satisfied that all the night gaunts had left for Sarkomand and the great abyss with their doomed burdens, the galley put back into the harbor betwixt gray headlands, and all the hideous company landed and roamed curiously over the denuded rock with its towers and eyries and fortress chiseled from the solid stone. Frightful were the secrets uncovered in those evil and windowless crypts, for the remnants of unfinished pastimes were many, and in the way certain things which were, after a fashion, alive, and fled precipitously from a few other things about which he could not be very positive. The stench-filled houses were furnished mostly with grotesque stools and benches carven from moon trees, and were painted inside with nameless and frantic designs. Countless weapons, implements, and ornaments lay about, including some large idols of solid ruby, depicting singular beings not found on the earth. These latter did not, despite their material, invite either appropriation or long inspection, and Carter took the trouble to hammer 5 of them into very small pieces. The scattered spears and javelins he collected, and, with Pickman's approval, distributed among the ghouls. Such devices were new to the dog-like lopers, but their relative simplicity made them easy to master after a few precise hints. The upper parts of the rock had more temples and private homes, and in numerous hewn chambers were found terrible carven altars and doubtfully stained fonts and shrines for the worship of things more monstrous than the wild entities atop Kadath. From the rear of one great temple stretched a low black passage, which Carter followed far into the rock with the torch till he came to a lightless, domed hall of vast proportions, whose vaultings were covered with demoniac carvings, and at whose center yawned a foul and bottomless well like that in the hideous monastery of Lang, where broods alone the high priest not to be described. On the distant shadowy side beyond the noisome well, he thought he discerned a small door of strangely wrought bronze, but for some reason he felt an unaccountable dread of opening it, or even approaching it, and hastened back through the cavern to his unlovely allies. As they shambled about with an ease and abandon he could scarcely feel, the ghouls had observed the unfinished pastimes of the moon beasts and had profited in their fashion. They had also found a hogshead of potent moon wine, and were rolling it down to the wharves of removal for later use in diplomatic dealings, though the rescued trio, remembering its effect on them in Dilathleen, had warned their company to taste none of it. And there's long been traditions of either bacterially or other substances of the certain vessels that alcoholic beverages were stored in or produced in. Whether this was part of the promptings that led to the production of the intoxicants in the first place, or whether people just looked at something and saw it pretty, but there's traditions that actually back up some of the former too. Of rubies from lunar mines, there was a great store, both rough and polished, in one of the vaults near the water, but when the ghouls found they were not good to eat, they lost all interest in them. Carter did not try to carry any away, since he knew too much about those who had mined them. Suddenly, there came an excited meeping from the sentries on the wharves, and all loathsome foragers turned from their tasks to stare seaward and cluster round the waterfront. Betwixt the grey headlands, a fresh black galley was rapidly advancing, and it would be but a moment before the almost humans on deck would perceive the invasion of the town and give the alarm to the monstrous things below. Fortunately, the ghouls still bore the spears and javelins, which Carter had distributed among them, and at his command, sustained by the being that was Pickman, they now formed a line of battle and prepared to prevent the landing of the ship. Presently, a burst of excitement on the galley told of the crew's discovery of the changed state of things, and the instant stoppage of the vessel proved that the superior numbers of the ghouls had been noted and taken into account. After a moment of hesitation, the newcomers silently turned and passed out between the headlands again. But not for an instant did the ghouls imagine that the conflict was averted. Either the dark ship would seek reinforcements, or the crew would try to land elsewhere on the island. Hence a party of scouts was at once sent up toward the pinnacle to see what the enemy's course would be. In a very few minutes, the ghoul returned breathless to say that the moon beasts and almost humans were landing on the outside of the more easterly of the rugged gray headlands, and ascending by hidden paths and ledges, which a goat could scarcely tread in safety. Almost immediately afterward, the galley was sighted again through the flume-like strait, but only for a second. Then a few moments later, a second messenger panted down from aloft to say that another party was landing on the other headland, both being much more numerous than the size of the galley would seem to allow for. The ship itself, moving slowly with only one sparsely manned tier of oars, soon hove in sight betwixt the cliffs, and lay to in the foetid harbor, as if to watch the coming fray and stand by for any possible use. By this time Carter and Pickman had divided the ghouls into three parties, one to meet each of the two invading columns and one to remain in town. The first two at once scrambled up the rocks in their respective directions, while the third was subdivided into a land party and a sea party. The sea party, commanded by Carter, boarded the anchored galley and rowed out to meet the unmanned galley of the newcomers, whereat the latter retreated through the strait to the open sea. Carter did not at once pursue it, for he knew that he might be needed more acutely near the town, Meanwhile, the frightful detachments of the moon beasts and almost humans had lumbered up to the top from the headlands and were shockingly silhouetted on either side against the gray twilight sky. The thin hellish flutes of the invaders had now begun to whine, and the general effect of those hybrid, half-amorphous processions was as nauseating as the actual odor given off by the toad-like lunar blasphemies. Then the two parties of the ghouls swarmed into sight and joined the silhouetted panorama. Javelins began to fly from both sides, and the swelling meeps of the ghouls and the bestial howls of the almost humans gradually joined the hellish whine of the flutes to form a frantic and indescribable chaos of Daman cacophony. Now and then bodies fell from the narrow ridges of the headlands into the sea outside or the harbor inside, in the latter case being sucked quickly under by certain submarine lurkers whose presence was indicated only by prodigious bubbles. For half an hour this dual battle raged in the sky till upon the west cliff the invaders were completely annihilated. On the east cliff, however, where the leader of the moon beast party appeared to be present, the ghouls had not fared so well and were slowly retreating to the slopes of the pinnacle proper. Pickman had quickly ordered reinforcements for this front from the party in the town, and these had helped greatly in the earlier stages of the combat. Then, when the western battle was over, the victorious survivors hastened across to the aid of their hard-pressed fellows, turning the tide and forcing the invaders back again along the narrow ridge of the headland. The almost humans were by this time all slain, but the last of the toad-like horrors fought desperately with the great spears clutched in their powerful and disgusting paws. The time for javelins was now nearly past, and the fight became a hand-to-hand contest of what few spearmen could meet upon that narrow ridge. As fury and recklessness increased, the number falling into the sea became very great. Those striking the harbor met nameless extinction from the unseen bubblers, but of those striking the open sea, some were able to swim to the foot of the cliffs and to land on tidal rocks, while the hovering galley of the enemy rescued several moon beasts. The cliffs were unscalable except where the monsters had debarked, so that none of the ghouls on the rocks could rejoin their battle line. Some were killed by javelins from the hostile galley, or from the moon beasts above, but a few survived to be rescued. When the security of the land parties seemed assured, Carter's galley sallied forth between the headlands and drove the hostile ship far out to sea, pausing to rescue such ghouls as were on the rocks or still swimming in the ocean. Several moon beasts washed on rocks or reefs were speedily put out of the way. Finally, the moon beast galley being safely in the distance and the invading land army concentrated in one place, Carter landed a considerable force on the eastern headland in the enemy's rear, after which the fight was short-lived indeed. Attacked from both sides, the noisome flounders were rapidly cut to pieces or pushed into the sea, till, by evening, the ghoulish chiefs agreed that the island was again clear of them. The hostile galley, meanwhile, had disappeared, and it was decided that the evil jagged rock had better be evacuated before any overwhelming horde of lunar horrors might be assembled and brought against the victors. So, by night, Pickman and Carter assembled all the ghouls and counted them with care. Finding that over a fourth had been lost in the day's battles, the wounded were placed on bunks in the galley, for Pickman always discouraged the old ghoulish custom of killing and eating one's own wounded, and the able-bodied troops were assigned to the oars or to such other places as they might most usefully fill. Under the low, phosphorescent clouds of night, the galley sailed, and Carter was not sorry to be departing from the island of unwholesome secrets, whose lightless domed hall, with its bottomless well and repellent bronze door, lingered restlessly in his fancy. Dawn found the ship in sight of Sarkoman's ruined quays of basalt, where a few night gaunts, sentries, still waited, squatting like black-horned gargoyles. On the broken columns and crumbling sphinxes of that fearful city which lived and died before the years of man. Alexander the Accursed, yes. No, that's got to be what this is connecting to. The ghouls made camp amongst the fallen stones of Sarkomand, dispatching a messenger for enough night gaunts to serve them as steeds. Samarkand? Yeah. Pickman and the other chiefs were effusive in their gratitude for the aid Carter had lent them. Carter now began to feel that his plans were indeed maturing well, and that he would be able to command the help of these fearsome allies, not only in quitting this part of Dreamland, but in pursuing his ultimate quests for the entities atop unknown Kadath, and the marvelous sunset city they so strangely withheld from his slumbers. Accordingly, he spoke of these things to the ghoulish leaders, telling what he knew of the cold waste wherein Kadath stands, and of the monstrous Shantax and the mountains carven into the double-headed images which guard it. He spoke of the fear of Shantax for night gaunts, and of how the vast hippocephalic birds fly screaming from the black burrows high up on the gaunt grey peaks that divide Inquanak from hateful Lang. He spoke, too, of the things he had learned concerning the night gaunts from the frescoes in the windowless monastery of the high priest not to be described, how even the great ones fear them, and how their ruler is not the crawling chaos, Nyarlathotep, at all, but hoary and immemorial Nodens, Lord of the great abyss. All these things Carter glibbered to the assembled ghouls, and presently outlined the request which he had in mind, which he did not think extravagant considering the services he had so lately rendered the rubbery, dog-like lopers. He wished very much, he said, for the services of enough night gaunts to bear him safely through the air past the realm of Shantax and Carven Mountains, and up into the old waste beyond the returning tracks of any other mortal. He desired to fly to the Ank's castle atop unknown Kadath in the cold waste to plead with the great ones. For the sunset city they denied him, and felt sure that the night gaunts could take him thither without trouble. High above the perils of the plain, and over the hideous double heads of those carven sentinel mountains that squat eternally in the grey dusk, for the horned and faceless creatures there could be no danger from aught of earth, since the great ones themselves dread them, and even were unexpected things to come from the other entities, who were prone to oversee the affairs of earth's milder entities. The night gaunts need not fear, for the outer hells are indifferent matters to such silent and slippery flyers as own not Nyarlathotep for their master, but bow only to potent and archaic Nodens. Well, just like sectarianism just ends up producing more sects, one of the things with rebellious demons is you'd expect that different ranks to just appear, and a flock of 10 or 15 night gaunts, Carter glibbered, would surely be enough to keep any combination of Shantax at a distance. Now perhaps it might be well to have some ghouls in the party to manage the creatures, their ways being better known to their ghoulish allies than to men. The party could not land him at some convenient point of view, within whatever walls that fabulous Ank's citadel might have, waiting in the shadows for his return or his signal, while he ventured inside the castle to give prayer to the entities of earth. If any ghouls chose to escort him into the throne room of the great ones, he would be thankful for their presence, would add weight and importance to his plea. He would not, however, insist upon this, but merely wished transportation to and from the castle-top unknown, Kadath. The final journey being either to the marvelous sunset city itself, in case of entities proved favorable, or back to the earthward gate of deep slumber, in the enchanted wood, in case his prayers were fruitless. Whilst Carter was speaking, all the ghouls listened with attention, and as the moments advanced, the sky became black with clouds of those night gaunts for which messengers had been sent. The winged steeds settled in a semicircle around the ghoulish army, waiting respectfully as the dog-like chieftains considered the wish of the earthly traveler. The ghoul that was Pickman gibbered gravely with his fellows, and in the end, Carter was offered far more than he had at most expected, and as he had aided the ghouls in their conquest of the moon beasts, so would they aid him in his daring voyage to realms whence none had ever returned, lending him not merely a few of their allied night gaunts, but their entire army as they encamped, veteran fighting ghouls and newly assembled night gaunts alike, save only a small garrison for the captured black galley and such spoils as had come from the jagged rock in the sea. They would set out through the air whenever he might wish, and once arrived on Kadath, a suitable train of ghouls would attend him in a state as he placed his petition before the earth's entities in their Ank's castle.